The following podcast is an Embassy Row production.
Hey everybody, I'm Marc Lamont Hill. I am a professor, a scholar, and most importantly, a book nerd. I say book nerd because I don't just love to read books. I'm the guy who loves to read about the book. I love hearing authors talk about how and why they wrote the book, and I love talking to other book nerds about their favorite books. That's why I started Coffee and Books. Every episode, I'll sit down over a cup of coffee with the world's biggest authors to discuss the most interesting, controversial, fun, or just important books. Sometimes we'll hang out with experts, fans, and other special guests to talk about some of the greatest books of all time. And today, I couldn't be happier as my first guest to have Eddie Glaude. Eddie Glaude is a professor at Princeton University. He's a chair of African American Studies. He's the author of many books, including Exodus, Race, Religion, and Nation in Early 19th Century Black America, Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, and his most recent book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. Eddie, good to see you, my brother.
Congratulations on the podcast.
Oh man, I'm so excited because there's no place right now that I can see where people can just hang out and talk about books. People do book lectures and book talks, but I want to do something different. I want to be able to talk to people about their journey, about the process, about all the layers of the book. And you can't do that in a 10-second soundbite.
Absolutely. That's what makes it so exciting. So I'm honored to be the first guest on the show.
Oh man. Well, you know, the other part of Coffee and Books is the coffee. So, you know, if we were in person, I'd have served you some coffee. You got some coffee. What kind of coffee does a prolific writer and scholar drink?
Because of my heart, I have to drink decaf. But if I was healthy, it would be Blue Mountain because, you know, I'm a particular kind of black man.
I'm a particular type too. So today what I'm drinking is actually black coffee. I don't ever do cream or sugar. I'm doing black coffee, but I also put a little bit of cognac in it. Do you know why?
So your version of an Irish, this is the black man's coffee. As opposed to Irish coffee. Wait.
It's actually far more Baldwin connected, right? In Giovanni's room, he orders coffee and cognac.
That's right.
And while Baldwin was writing Go Tell It on the Mountain, in Café de Flore in France, he would sit upstairs and drink coffee and cognac.
That's right.
I am going to attribute my early morning drinking to Baldwin today.
I would be happy with that.
So talk to me about Begin Again. Why write this book now?
Well, there are a couple of reasons, right? So the first reason is that I've been walking with Jimmy for a while, since graduate school, when I made the fateful decision to actually let him in. I knew that there was a danger in reading Baldwin, at least for me. But once I started reading him, I didn't stop.
What's the danger? What's the danger in reading Baldwin?
Baldwin demands a kind of honesty and introspection. He takes seriously the Socratic dictum that the unexamined life isn't worth living. And so there's this insistence on a kind of self-interrogation. Before you can say anything about the world, you have to be able to be honest with yourself. In other words, dealing with the messiness that's inside you is a precondition for dealing with the messiness of the world. And so as I was writing the book, you know, I kept looking up and there would be a glass of whiskey right in front of me, you know, because he was throwing me back on myself in a way where I had to examine the scaffolding of my own lives, right? And really interrogate what work they were doing. So there's that. The other part is that unlike any other writer in American letters, Baldwin's understanding of the contradiction of American democracy is unparalleled. And what I wanted to do was to kind of explore how he dealt with his moment of betrayal, how he bounced back, if he ever did, and how it could help me in my own moment where I felt like the country turned its back again. And so, how shall we say, mine the ruins, as he would put it, right? Make my way through the rubble to see what was there, what he offered me. And that meant going to the late Baldwin, which a lot of folk don't read a lot these days. You know?
Absolutely. So let's back into this because you said a few things that I think are super important. The first thing is you said you're walking with Jimmy. What you do in this book is very interesting. There are some writers who will just do a close reading of Baldwin's work. It'll be a book about Baldwin, about Baldwin's ideas, about a period in Baldwin's life, about a particular book. People get PhDs just studying one singular text, if not a short story of Baldwin, right? It's possible to do that. And then other people and we've seen this in other books, will use Baldwin as a kind of launching point for analyzing the world, right? Michael Eric Dyson wrote a book about a year ago,
Right.
looking at sort of Baldwin's meeting with Kennedy to say, hey, wait, there's an interesting insight that we can learn from that speaks to a broader issue. And then some people write kind of reflective pieces about what Baldwin meant to them.
Right.
What you've managed to do in this book is weave those things together. So when you say you're walking with Jimmy, you're analyzing his work closely and subtly, but you're also helping us understand how Baldwin has something to say about this moment. Was that the goal, or did you stumble into that? Was the goal always to write the book with all those pieces, or did you find something different?
Thank you for recognizing that, Mark. So the initial move was to write a kind of biography of Baldwin, right? To kind of stick with the biographical, to make explicit the way in which Jimmy has shaped my reading of pragmatism and the like. When you read In a Shade of Blue, every chapter in a Shade of Blue has an epigraph of Baldwin framing that chapter, except for the last one. And the last chapter begins with Toni Morrison, who said she found language in Baldwin's prose, right?
In a Shade of Blue, by the way, is Eddie Glaude's second book after Exodus, right?
Yes.
Right. Sort of helping us think about the kind of American philosophical tradition of pragmatism and how that can be sort of connected to the Black experience in America and helping us think through some of that stuff. Really powerful text. Yeah.
So Baldwin is everywhere in Democracy in Black. He's in the background, moving the argument at every turn. So what I wanted to do was bring him from backstage and bring him bring him up front, and then kind of engage in this biographical work, and in the process offer this particular reading of him and his life. But then dealing with the archive, dealing with the difficulties around getting access to certain kinds of materials, I realized that I couldn't write that book. And so I'm sitting there, a year in to the contract, after signing that contract, thinking, I haven't put a word to page yet. What can I do? And then I started thinking about the moment. And suddenly I just started writing, jotting down ideas. And what came to me was not to write about Jimmy, but to think with him, to take the moment that I'm living in and bring my thoughts to bear on it as I'm thinking with Jimmy about this broader American project. So the book became this odd admixture of biography, literary criticism, social criticism, and I had to figure out how to manage that at the level of form, how to move back and forth, how to bring him in and not let him overwhelm me, right? How not to be a sycophant, right? Mm-hmm. How to figure out ways of distancing as well as embrace, and then how to allow my rage to stand alongside his, and how to temper his with how I temper mine, right? So all of this was happening as I was trying to write the book, So, and I remember the first drafts I gave. You would like this, Mark. I gave the first draft of the first 4 chapters to Michael Thelwell, who was close partners with Baldwin at University of Massachusetts Amherst, professor of African American Studies at Amherst, Massachusetts Amherst, was a member of SNCC, was a part of National NAG at Howard. Just a bad brother, who doesn't hold his tongue. Jamaican brother doesn't hold his tongue. And I gave him the first 4 chapters in this early iteration. He said, "What is this bullshit?" I thought you were smart,
Wow.
Because I was trying to figure out in those first iterations how to do it. And it took a minute.
Well, you definitely got there. And one of the things that anchors this text is this idea of the lie. Throughout the book, you return to this idea of the lie. Help us understand what the lie is.
So the lie is this broad architecture that allows the country to view itself as an example of democracy achieved, as Americans as the most virile, the most honest, the most decent, the country as the redeemer nation. And these moments of contradiction are just simply that, moments. They don't speak to the core of who we take ourselves to be as a country. So the lie is this idea that democracy wasn't, in fact, rooted, shaped, distorted by a commitment to white supremacist ideology, right? And the way in which we've built a broad architecture to cover it, right? To protect this sense of who we take ourselves to be. And, there's that moment in The Fire Next Time where Jimmy says, in effect, we have the privilege of not having believed the lie. That's how I got it. That's where I found it, right? And that lie is this idea that America is, and I'm repeating myself here, is an example of democracy achieved, when in fact, it is this extraordinary articulation of white supremacy within a body of democratic principles, right? That's always engaging in this distorting and disfiguring kind of work, it seems to me. And part of the work that we need to do is to reveal the lie for what it is so that we can free ourselves from it in order to imagine ourselves anew.
What unique skills or insights or experiences did Baldwin bring to it to understand the lie?
Well, I think you're right to say that Baldwin is not unique in this. I think he brings a certain kind of power to giving voice to it. There's a sense in which growing up poor in Harlem, not growing up on Sugar Hill, leaving the country at a fairly young age, and literally willing himself into becoming a writer, and understanding that very act of self-creation required an extraordinary engagement with all of the detritus, all of the shit that's in him that the nation put there, seeing what happened to his stepfather, whom he called his father. So I think there's a host of experiences that aren't unique to him, but a host of experiences bound up with his temperament and his insistence on the moral nature of the problem and his firm belief that this idea of self-creation requires, right, an interrogation of the very idea of America itself as a precondition for, how can I say, making a self that's not tethered to it, that's not enslaved by it, that's not beaten down by it. So I think what gives him a certain kind of distinctiveness and uniqueness is that as an artist, as a certain kind of temperamental artist, Baldwin comes to the lie with a certain kind of project in mind, which is rooted in this kind of self-creation, which then becomes the ground for a broader account of a new America, if that makes sense.
I'm glad you said New America, because part of what you also do in the book is give us a sense of how those insights are useful for today, but also the parallels of these moments, right? That what Baldwin is wrestling with and trying to get America to come to terms with is very similar to what you're trying to get America to come to terms with, and what all of us are trying to get America to come to terms with, especially in this moment in 2020. In fact, there are times when I'm reading the intro and the conclusion of the book that if I didn't understand publishing better, I would have thought you wrote last week or last month, because of just how profoundly precise they are in their understanding of what's going on at this juncture in history. So I guess a few months ago, you had a viral moment on MSNBC where there was an American tragedy and you had really a Baldwinian moment.
It was straight up Jimmy. I had just written that. Yeah, it was exactly.
It was like you held America accountable for what it was and how it was, and you didn't pull any punches. I mean, you didn't pull any punches in your criticism of America, not just in terms of who we are as a people right now, but as you say, the lie, right? Exposing the idea that we're not who we think we are, and we need to be something else. For me, like I said, it sounded like Baldwin was talking through you. How does that lie that Baldwin was exposing in the 50s and 60s and even 70s, honestly, up until 84, how does that connect to the moment we see now?
Oh, it's absolutely essential, right? So part of what I was trying to do in that moment, it was right after the El Paso massacre.
Yeah.
And I'm watching a colleague try to hold himself together because he was from El Paso. And every time he answered a question that Nicole Wallace asked him, he almost lost it. He was trying to hold back tears. And I was getting angrier and angrier in that moment. And part of the work that I wanted to do is to say, yo, we cannot exceptionalize this dude. Because there's this idea that Trump is the bearer of all of our evils. If only we get rid of him, then everything is good. So we exceptionalize. And I was like, no. It's easy for this brother, Sam Stein, Jewish brother, to say that Pittsburgh is a result of Donald Trump. It's easy for me to say that Charleston was because of Donald Trump. It's easy for the other brother to say El Paso was because of Trump, when in fact, This was a reflection of who we are, of this idea of whiteness, right? That leads folk to believe that because you're white, that you somehow should be valued differently than someone who's not white. And so part of the work that I wanted to do was, and I was really channeling Jimmy in that moment, right? Because I come out of a tradition that we've had to bear the burden of that lie. We've had to bear the burden of that willful ignorance and that innocence that protects them from the crimes, right? And so part of what Jimmy wanted to do in the 50s and 60s and 70s and even up until 87 when he dies, he wanted to break through that lie. He wanted to shatter those illusions and those myths that provided safety for this identity of whiteness, this identity of Americanness that did so much evil, that was so cruel and barbaric in some ways in its outcome. So every generation, Mark, we have to deal with this damn lie.
Yes.
We have to encounter its consequences. And Donald Trump lies, as my mama would say, through his teeth on a regular basis. So It is a perfect parallel in so many ways.
You said something here that shook me. You said, for white people in this country, America is an identity worth protecting at any cost. What does that mean?
You know, you're a student of history, that anytime white America believes that its understanding of itself is in jeopardy, they get violent. We can see this in the context of the carnage of the Civil War. We can see this in the brutality and violence of the nadir. We can see this in the context of the mid-20th century. We can even see elements of it around the election of Barack Obama and his ascendants, as white Christian identity groups and white supremacy organizations have gone through the roof. And then, of course, on that spectrum, how the Tea Party emerged and the like. So there's a sense in which American identity is so tethered to this idea that whiteness, or that white people matter more than others. At the moment you question that view, the very foundation of their self-conception is shaken. And when that happens, there are all of these ritual processes that kick in order to right the stones, right? To get the foundation set again. And so it becomes almost a difficult task then. It's not, doesn't become almost, it is. It is a terribly difficult task to get us to the point to where we can interrogate how this identity undermines the very notion of democracy itself. I say in the book that this idea of white America is irredeemable, but that doesn't mean we are. There's no way to salvage that. We just got to leave that aside. For white America, those people who are invested in that, they can't imagine what that would look like at all. And that's the problem.
God, there's so many things I want to ask you. You talk about the after times, right? Which is what you're getting at. You've been alluding to the after, but in the book, you very specifically use the language of the after times, which comes from Walt Whitman, right?
Yeah.
And you said in the after times, right? Again, you meant post-Civil War, post this, post that. Hope is not yet lost, even if the call to reimagine the country has been answered with violence. We're in a moment right now of violence from the state. Are we in an aftertime right now? Is the violence we're seeing from the state a reflective of the aftertime, or are we approaching the aftertime?
No, I think we are in the aftertime.
Of the rebellion that just happened?
No, of the Obama era, of what the Obama era ushered in, right? So part of what happens is like you have a moment, right? It's the crossroads. And that moment throws everything into the air and nothing is quite settled yet. So we have an opportunity to reimagine ourselves. And then decisions are being made to consolidate a particular view, right? To double down on the ugliness in order to hold back fundamental transformation. So the after times of of Reconstruction becomes, Whitman is writing at the moment in which the Gilded Age is taking root, right? After times of the Black freedom struggle of the mid-20th century, Reaganism is taking root. So here we are in a moment of Trumpism. Trumpism is the response to that Obama moment, right? It opens up. So everything seems to be fluid, but we see in some ways the Obama era, it seemed to be fluid. And then boom, Trump comes in to try to shut the door. And he's trying to shut the door, but there's this moment because the after times is unsettling. So before it actually takes root, there's an opportunity, a moment for us to be otherwise. This is what Stuart Hall would call the conjunctural moment. This is what Robert Johnson would call the crossroads, or what Houston Baker would pull out, right, as that blues metaphor, right? What does it mean to be at that inflection point? And that's where we are, I think, in this moment. And hope is there precisely because the crisis reveals an opportunity.
Another thing that emerges in the moment of Baldwin, according to you, and I'm inclined to agree, is Baldwin himself as a figure. You know, there are moments in time where particular figures emerge. In 1992, there was a conversation about Malcolm X that resurged, right? There's been a conversation about Assata Shakur that has emerged in the post-Ferguson moment for multiple reasons. Baldwin as a figure, as an image, as an icon, and as a thought leader has reemerged over the last 10 years. Yeah. Why is Baldwin so important to this generation of thinkers, activists, writers, scholars, and everyday citizens?
You know, because Baldwin is queering Black politics. He's queering the American canon. And I'm using queering in a very technical sense, right? That is, right, he's giving us this angle of vision, of view, that unsettles assumptions, that shape what we take Black leadership to be, what we take Black politics to entail, how we imagine America as such. Baldwin becomes this resource to to destabilize a certain set of assumptions around Black church, around Black leaders, right, in a whole range of ways. So it makes sense that young folk, particularly young queer folk who led Black Lives Matter in Ferguson in that moment, who were in the foreground, would reach for him as a resource in that moment. Plus, Baldwin is this complex figure, because when you pick him up, you're going to have to deal with rage and love. You're going to have to deal with anger and faith. Right? He's not going to bite his tongue about this place. This is why Begin Again focuses on the later Baldwin, because what people will do is that they will gravitate to Fire Next Time and read it only in a certain way, or they will think Notes of a Native Son, or read the early stuff, right? Yeah. Because they think the later Baldwin is a bit too angry, right? A bit too biting, as it were.
Is it read as hopeless?
It's read as him succumbing to the pessimism of the age, right? That some people read it in a very cynical way, that he's lost a step, the old man has gone bad in the teeth, and that he just wants to continue to be relevant, that he's found himself too cozy with Black power. His fame and celebrity has distracted him from attention to his craft. And so there's this kind of quick dismissal, not only of the nonfiction, but of the novels. But I'm saying to folks, no. His most important nonfiction, his most important book of essays, to my mind, is No Name in the Street. And that just baffles people.
Right? It baffles me, to be honest. It was one of my questions for you. So it's like choosing among your children in some sense, right? But you returned to No Name in the Street in this text in a way that I did not expect. And I knew what the book was about. But there's a way that you lean on that text as a sort of, not just for its critical analysis, but as almost like the best lens through which to understand who Baldwin is in that moment. What does that book give us that the others don't, even of that decade?
Man, that's such a great question, Doc. Baldwin called No Name in the Street this mighty motherfucker, because he was trying his best to get it out of his head, right? And Mark, we have to read No Name as the first book written post-King's assassination. So when they kill Dr. King, Baldwin collapses. It's not just simply he goes into a depression. No, Baldwin collapses in 1969. Not only in 1969, a relationship falters. King, he can't find his voice, so he tries to commit suicide. Yeah. And it's one of many times that he tries to take his life, right? And so Baldwin is trying to find a language in the aftermath of King's murder. They killed King.
Yeah.
Right? What does that say about them, right? He's not naive, as I write in the book, about the evil of white folks. He's not naive about it. But what does it say about them if they would kill him?
Right. The nonviolent one, right? Malcolm's gone at this point, right? Others are gone, but him. Ugh.
Him, the apostle of love, right? And then he's already seeing in the eyes of those kids, right? The eyes of those kids, those students he met at Howard. He sees in the eye of Stokely and Cortland Cox and Muriel Tillinghast and all these folk, right? Michael Thelwell and these folk, because he was in their room in 63 as they were in the bowels of the South and promised them he would never betray them. Just 3 years later, 2 years later, he sees them and he sees the darkness and despair and disillusionment in their eyes and in their spirit.
Yeah.
Baldwin's trying to figure out, how the hell am I going to respond? How am I going to pick up the pieces? And No Name in the Street is the answer. So if we don't read the book as a response to the collapse, then we're going to read it out of context. I read the book as, at the level of form, Mark, a book about trauma and wound. The book returns, it mentions a moment, the past, moves into the present, returns back to the past. Give you an example. The very way in which Toni Morrison structures memory in Beloved, it's in No Name in the Street.
Oof.
It's in the book. You can see it, the way in which he's structuring, the way memory fractures in the face of wound, how he misremembers.
This is really important, right? What does it mean? Because what you're doing here is you're allowing us to understand how Baldwin's actual writing is a reflection of a certain kind of trauma. Let me back up so everyone understands what I'm talking about. There's a moment here where Baldwin explains why he leaves France. And he says that it was stirred by what happens with Dorothy Counts in the ordeal at Harding High School. And the problem, as you point out, is that it couldn't have happened that way, right? The thing that brings him back from France couldn't have been that because the dates don't match up. The time doesn't match up. So you critique him for that, but you also give him some grace and say, there's some reasons why he may have misremembered this. He wasn't lying. He wasn't being dramatic. This wasn't some dramatic move where Baldwin was trying to get attention. You're saying, no, Baldwin, there's a reason. And Baldwin even says, not to trust his memories, right?
Oh, yeah.
Much has been blotted out, coming back only lately in bewildering and untrustworthy flashes. The reason why this is important is because you're saying that Baldwin is hit by trauma, and the trauma of death, the trauma of white supremacy, all these things are making it very difficult for him to properly remember. Then you tell us, and this is where I think it gets interesting, for me anyway, is that trauma and memory plays out in how he writes his books, in that particular way he writes. What does traumatic memory or rememory look like for James Baldwin?
Right. So on the one hand, it can look like misremembering or disremembering.
Right.
Right. It could, we hear that language in Morrison and the way in which Toni talks about what's happening in Beloved with Setha and Paul D and the like, right? How do we stand in relation to that wound that constitutes that kind of foundational moment, right? So here, Baldwin in this phase of his life, Mark, is always talking about the death of Medgar, the death of of Malcolm, the death of Martin, how these dead matter. And, and we're not even talking about Sammy Young and all the other folk who literally line the bottom of the Mississippi River right now, right? Yeah. So at one level, it's about, how do I recall a movement that had such promise in the space of time that moves so quickly?
Yeah.
Right. So in the context of postmodern, whatever postmodern is for some folk out there, right? One of the things that Mark Taylor and others will talk about is that within the context of late capitalism, time moves.
Right.
It's quick. Baldwin is trying to figure out, how do I account for a movement that has collapsed within this span of time? And all of this death has happened. So there's this moment where he's narrating what happened in Montgomery. He returns to Montgomery, and I quote the passage at length. And he has his typewriter, and he sees these sheriffs, and the sheriffs, represent a kind of debasedness of the soul that he thinks is that. So he's talking about the first time he met Martin, right? But then he narrates what had not happened by that time yet. Bobby Hutton was still alive. Angela hadn't been on the FBI wanted list. So it's a brilliant move, right? Because he's trying to account for the moment in itself, but then account for what has happened between then and now. And it's not like 50 years. It's not like,
although it felt like it, right?
Exactly. So at the level of form, you get this kind of circling back, right? This movement forward and circling back, kind of all this movement in that way. I want to say that in that experimentation in No Name, we actually see it showing up in the novels. We see it showing up elsewhere in the corpus.
Yeah.
So No Name in the Street becomes the gateway to the later work, it seems to me. So we got to understand it in that way. Does that make sense?
That makes complete sense. No, it's. I want to nerd out more on this subject, but I want to move to some other things, because this is important. One, we've been talking about James Baldwin's form. I want to ask you a question about how you write. One, this book, and then two more broadly. There's another thing you do here that I thought was so interesting. It's very small, but it's also very big. When you talked about James Baldwin's father, you said he died believing tragically what white America said about him. So as soon as I hear that line, I immediately think of Fire Next Time. And I think about him writing to his nephew, right? Very similar language, right? There's a way that you're sort of using Baldwin as a muse to write, even in the language, these subtle allusions to Baldwin texts. How intentional were you at sort of, because you don't footnote it, you don't slide, it's a very subtle move. You have to already have read The Fire Next Time and understand how powerful that line is to understand what you're doing. So you're not just talking about Baldwin here or Baldwin's stepfather, you're also bringing in this whole other text in a very subtle way. That's a hell of a thing to have to do as a writer. And you have to trust the reader.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Or certain readers, right?
Fair.
Right. And so there's a sense in which, there's a moment where I'm in the introduction where I'm a bit more heavy-handed, where I'm visiting the house in St. Paul de Vence, and I describe it as a kind of archaeological site in some ways. And I look up and I see the village, and I write, just above my head, there's a village. Now, right in that moment, I'm signifying on the last novel.
Right.
Just using the phrase, right? So part of as a writer, what I want to do is to bring my bibliography to bear on the page, but not in some heavy-handed way where my knowledge of Jimmy and his corpus is just, parading across the page where it's, this performance, as it were.
Right.
But rather to kind of sit within his work and to engage in allusions and to place it in a conversation with our tradition, right? So to think with Jim, because he did it. So there are moments when I'm writing, Mark, and there's a formulation about us being blind to each other, not seeing the human being right in front of us. And I know at that moment that I'm engaging Jimmy, but I also know at that moment that Jimmy is engaging Henry James.
Right.
And he's reading the novel The Ambassador, and that this is Strathern, right? So how can I play on this line? And all of this is about being deliberate at the moment in which you're sitting right in front of the computer and you're thinking about the book, right? So this is what I'm doing. This is what I'm doing in those moments.
It's powerful and it's subtle, and it's right in our tradition, whether it's a blues tradition, whether it's, there's so many places where it's happening, right? When Erykah Badu is doing On and On, and she begins with that drum beat, boom, 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 boom. She's alluding to Mary J. Blige's Real Love without ever saying it, right? So we can be in conversation with text without ever having to explicitly say it. Jay-Z's always in conversation with Biggie, right? And that's what you're doing. It's a very interesting writerly move, and I think sometimes writers, particularly writers who feel like they need to prove how much they know about a thing, have to rattle off everything that they know about a thing, when, to my mind, sometimes the most brilliant writing is when you are confident in the writing and in your knowledge base, and it comes through the writing. Let me ask you a process question. How do you prepare to write a book about someone with such a wide body of work, fiction and nonfiction, as James Baldwin? What do you do?
Pray. No, 5 times a day.
Right.
I've been walking with him for so long, right? Trying to understand him. There's so much there, so many words written. And so I think, what does it mean to walk with a figure and not get lost in him, where you could still hear your voice? So I kept asking myself the question, why Jimmy? Why me? Why now?
Yeah.
Right? So always coming to him, not in a transactional way, but rather as a resource for my own kind of effort to create a particular kind of artistic imagining. What does it mean for me? Because to be frank, I wanted to announce to all of my friends, all of my readers, that I'm a writer. You feel me? I wanted this book to not just simply be Eddie Glaude, who was trained by Cornel West, who knows philosophy of religion, who can do this, the scholar. I wanted to announce that I'm a writer, that I can craft sentences.
Is this the first time you felt like a writer?
There are moments in Democracy in Black where I knew what I was doing. Right. There are moments when I was avoiding certain kind of citational practices, where I knew where I was forging that sentence in a way that it carried the weight that if you read it or Jeff Stout read it, they would be like, oh, damn, that was that. And then if my mama read it, she would be like, oh, that's a nice sentence, baby.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So those multiple audiences. Right. And so I knew there were moments like that. With this book, I would write a sentence and then I would get up and start pacing, or I would send it to Imani Perry and she would go, yo, that's dope. And, that sort of thing. So it's the first book, Mark, in its totality that I could say that I tried to write it.
It reads that way. I've read every book you've ever written, and Exodus is very much a book that a scholar writes to prove that they know everything there is to know about this particular topic, right? And it's a wonderful book, about Black people's relationship to the Exodus story and their sort of freedom dreams. I saw in Shade of Blue you making that pivot, attempting to, but it was like you were trying to write to a broad audience with a scholarly voice, and so they didn't match, right? It wasn't, the book was brilliant, but it was almost like you were talking to the wrong people with it, in my estimation. Right. And then when you got to Democracy in Black, for me, it was like, okay, this is the sweet spot where you have a deep analysis that's underpinned by this deep philosophical understanding, but you're communicating it to a broad audience. And this book is the one where you're continuing on that pace, but now to your point, you are now a writer. This is a writerly book, right? This is a book where you thought very carefully about being a writer. And why I think that's interesting is for all the academics and scholars who will listen to this podcast to think about writing not just as a function of our jobs. We have to write to stay alive. We publish or perish, right?
Exactly.
But to think about writing as the craft of writing as a form of inquiry, writing as a form of expression, writing as a form of therapy, writing as a form of politics, right? The writing itself, right? When Assata Shakur uses a lowercase I throughout the entire memoir, that's a political move and it's a writerly move, right? These are the types of things that we see in writing that I think you're doing here in very interesting ways. But there's an intimacy question I have for you.
Uh-oh.
I have never encountered a biographer or literary critic who has talked about the subject of their piece with such intimacy. When you're talking, even throughout this podcast, right, you say, I walk with, you talk about Jimmy as if he's in the other room, right? Not as if he's someone who died 3 decades ago, right? More than 3 decades ago. You say, I want to walk with him. I don't want him to overpower the page. He's with me. I don't want to, I want to make sure that my writing lives up to him. I want to make sure that I honor him. You talk about him in a very intimate way, not just as somebody who studied him closely, but as someone who has a deep love and connection that extends beyond scholar and unit of analysis. What is that intimacy?
Oh man, I've never been asked that question. Man, it's hard to put in words, right? So in the introduction, I talk about evading Jimmy because I knew that he was going to throw me back onto my own wounds.
Yeah.
I'm a vulnerable boy on the inside. And I remember calling my dad just last week and saying to him that, we got to write a piece together. And he was like, what you mean? I said, I want to write a piece together so we can show people our journey together. So what does it mean that you could just look at me when I was a kid and I start crying because I was so scared of you? And now you calling me to tell me what I should say on the news, right? and telling me that you love me, right? And the first question I was going to ask him, man, is how do you feel knowing that your baby boy wondered whether or not you loved him?
Oof.
And using that as a point of entry.
And I wasn't going to ask you this, but since you brought it up, you talk about Baldwin's relationship to his father, and you've begun to talk about this already, but Baldwin said something that hit me so hard. He said, I was always told that I was ugly. My father told me that, and everybody else, but mostly my father. So I believed it naturally. Until today, I believed it. I was to hurt a great many people by being unable to imagine that anyone could possibly be in love with an ugly boy like me. He talked about how the trauma of his relationship with his father sort of shaped how he navigated the world. And you've talked about that relationship. How has Baldwin helped you understand your relationship to your father? I know you said you're willing to write and explore, but what did you learn from Baldwin's relationship? What did Baldwin teach you or not teach you?
This is really great a great question, because to read Baldwin over the course of his life is to read a very different accounting of his father.
Yeah.
So to read Baldwin in Notes of a Native Son, where the birth of his youngest sister coincides with the urban rebellion in Harlem and his father's funeral and all of this, right? It's an exacting judgment of his dad. But to read the way in which he accounts for his father by the time Jimmy is put in the grave, it's a much more generous reading. His father becomes less monstrous and more a victim of the circumstances of his life. So you see, he changes the accents. There's continuity. He changes where the accents are put or placed. So Baldwin has helped me in my journey. So I remember I left home at 15, 16 years old, and I knew why. My dad told me, I know why you're trying to leave, but don't ever think you won't want nothing from me, as he put it. Don't ever think you're not going to need me. And then when I lost my scholarship at Morehouse because I got up there and got wild, as you can imagine, he just took out a second mortgage without question and paid for a semester of tuition without even asking me a question. And then I promised him, I said, I'll get it back. I promise you. And now, so that journey, in my own life, I've become less harsh in my judgment. And I think Jimmy has given me a language for that in some ways. But I do know this, just as Jimmy grappled with the feeling that he could not be loved because of what his father did to him, I'm always grappling with the fact that I'm scared. So the idea, and I want this for dads to know this, and then I duplicated it myself. What does it mean to instill fear in your child? To put it at the depth of their being, to see that a certain shift in the eyes or movement of the eyebrows or the head could literally send a shudder through your baby. That fear is here. And so every time I'm out here being courageous, every time I'm out here saying what's on my mind without fear of consequence, every time when I even took that step at Morehouse when I knew they could throw me out, I was trying to prove to myself that I'm not a scared little boy. And Baldwin gave me the license to say that out loud.
Wow.
So what Jimmy did, man, for me, and what he does for me, he reminds me that and I said this earlier, but I want to emphasize this more, that the precondition to say anything about the world is that I have to deal with my mess. I got to deal with what's going on the inside, my brokenness, not to aspire to wholeness, because that's not the issue. That gets you all jacked up because I'm broken. I can never be whole. The idea is to kind of understand the beauty in that brokenness, to really grapple with it. So that requires a kind of honesty with myself. But then I learned this, because again, I'm never trying to lose my voice. I learned that Jimmy's demand for honesty can border on narcissism. That it could leak into a kind of insensitivity with those around him. That people around him could be in the service of him and his desires. You read his letters between him and David, you just say, God, I want to hear David's voice. I need to hear David's voice because Jimmy's just constantly asking for something. Or then you think about that interview with him and Nikki Giovanni. As crazy as that interview is, that exchange is.
Yeah.
There's this moment in that interview, Mark, where Nikki says, lie to me.
Right.
Lie to me. You going out here, you doing all of this in order to exist in the world, and you come home and you do all of this.
We get the worst
lie
of
to
it.
me.
Yeah.
Yeah, we get the worst of it. And so there are moments in Jimmy's demand for honesty that he loses sight that sometimes in the name of love, you gotta lie.
Baldwin clearly is a towering influence on you. Who else do you walk with? What other writers and thinkers do you walk with?
Oh, that's hard in these days, especially right now, because
Give me four. Give
you a four. So Toni Morrison, I love just the way in which she uses language, and she's She's a novelist of ideas, even though people say even though people might not read her in that way. Dewey,
Wow.
I walk with John Dewey in a very clear way.
That's a fascinating choice given how you're just talking about craft.
Yeah, because he can't write a sentence.
He's one of the worst writers I've ever John Dewey may be the worst writer I've ever encountered in relative to his talent, to his intellectual abilities.
Right. I mean, it's his one time I described his sentences like swollen feet. They're just terrible, You ought to read his poetry. It's even worse.
Oh God. I'll pass. But
I'm gonna say this, and I'll say this. Cornell, man.
Cornell West.
Cornell West. Cornell is a figure who, as a human being, who's just so important to who I am as a human being. But the questions Cornell asks, there's African American studies pre-Cornell and African American studies post-Cornell, and I think it's because of the questions that he asks and what he opened the door to. Exodus could not have been written if it wasn't for my encounter with him. The way which I think the questions I grapple with wouldn't be what they are if it wasn't for him. So,
and of course, his path-breaking book, since we shout out books on the podcast as well, Prophesy Deliverance, is one of the most important texts. Afro-American Revolutionary Christianity is one of the most important sort of texts in Black religious thought, Black religious scholarship. It opens up doors. So if anyone is interested in that area of reading or thought, it's really a central text. And
when I was teaching at Bowdoin, Mark, I had taught us, I had students like Melvin Rogers, who's now at Brown and other places. And I taught Prophesy. I said, read the footnotes. Just get in the footnotes. Build your library based on the footnotes. And because it was an education right in that moment, right? Yeah. So Prophesy is absolutely key. Let me give you another novelist. My man, Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Ooh, that's a good one. A lot of people don't think that people like you, scholars, read novelists other than as an escape, maybe as an intellectual retreat, but don't necessarily think about how we might read a novel as a way of informing the life of the mind itself.
Oh, absolutely, man. Fiction, the novel, we've been dealing with the end of the novel for I don't know how long, but, it gives us an insight into the formation of character, right? So if we think of education as build-up, as the shaping of character, you're going to reach for resources wherever you find them. And, Marquez's critique of colonialism, Marquez's critique of capitalism, the way in which he deploys the imagination in the service of a radical politics. Gabo showed up for his Nobel, man, in an outfit that announced to the world, I want you to know who I identify with.
Right.
And so, this is what I'm talking about. And what I've tried to do in that moment in trying to answer your question is to give you a sense of the kind of, I'm a precocious reader, right? If that's the right word.
No, I think you're right. I think you're right. Your process. How often do you write?
Writing is not just simply putting sentences on the page. I like to read writers on writing.
Yes.
So I'll read Henry James's prefaces. I'll read, all kinds of stuff. Kundera's work on writing, who's one of my favorite novelists as well. But I do a lot of thinking before I get to the page. So I'm building, and I write in my head. So I'm building arguments, building the architecture, because I don't outline on the page. I don't do prior outline.
Really? This is interesting. So you're not an outliner, and you do a lot of your stuff in your head.
And then I handwrite.
Now that's some Cornell West stuff right there. So I definitely see the influence now.
I have a hybrid process, right? So as I'm thinking and I'm trying to piece together the structure of the argument, and I'm reading, then the first sentence will come to me. I'll jot it down in my mode book right next to my bed. Then I'll get to the page. I'll get to the computer, and I'll write that first sentence. And then I'll go and I'll start writing, and I type in Courier New because I'm an old school dude. I want
it to feel like a typewriter.
Exactly. Right. So, and I'll write, Mark, until I stop. And usually I might stop at a paragraph, or I might stop because transitions, the bridges are always hard for me. And I think it's because Ellison told me they were hard. Right. So, and then I'll print, and then I'll get the print, and then I'll get my pen and I'll edit what I've written. And then as I'm editing, it'll get me the transition to the next paragraph. And then I'll grab my folder, my pad, and then I'll just start writing. And then I'll write until I stop, right? When I have a transition issue. Then I'll take the handwritten stuff and the edit stuff. Then I'll turn back to the computer and then I'll start typing it all in. And then as I'm typing it in, I get past that next transition. Then next thing I'll keep writing and then the process keeps going. So it's just.
Wow, that sounds painful. And in the best way possible. In the best way possible. It's everybody's process is different. I've never heard that process before. Maybe painful is not the word. It's intense, it's rigorous, but it's also very systematic. Before we go, I need to do something. You're gonna hate me for this. That's all I can tell you. So I'm gonna give you 3 books. One you buy, one you can borrow, and the other you burn. The reason I love this game because it tortures the guest, right? Because all the choices are good, right? And of course, we don't really want to burn any books, but the idea is you can only keep one. You know, you can borrow the other, and the other one you got to burn. So this will be interesting. Here are the 3 books.
Okay.
Go Tell It on the Mountain, The Fire Next Time, and No Name in the Street.
Man.
I told you you're going to hate me. I told you you were going to hate me for this.
I ought to opt out. You know, you ought to be.
There's no escape hatch here.
Bartleby the Scrivener. I prefer not. No. So I'm going to buy No Name in the Street. I'm going to borrow The Fire Next Time. And I'm going to burn Go Tell It on the Mountain.
Whew, I could even hear it in your voice. I know. I shouldn't get this much pleasure from this, but.
I'm so sorry, Jimmy. I'm so sorry.
I can hear him throwing a glass. He would be throwing a glass at you right now from heaven.
Yeah, you know, the reason I say that is because, you know, I think Jimmy, as an essayist, is one of the greatest in the world.
Yeah. As
a novelist, he's always reaching for something. He doesn't handle that genre in the same way.
That's an important analysis. And for those who haven't read it, Go Tell It on the Mountain. That's why I put Go Tell It on the Mountain in there also, because it's also an interesting first kind of stab, right? So he hasn't reached his height even as a novelist, but he never hits But he never hits his stride as a novelist the way he does as an essayist, you would argue.
Right. I think he makes some interventions and he's innovative within the genre, but his voice, right, is so powerful that it's going to make its way through the character one character at some point, right? So I know some people will disagree with me here, but I tend to gravitate to his nonfiction, although I read his fiction. So I'm always going to choose the nonfiction. But Go Tell It on the Mountain is probably one of the better of the novels.
Absolutely. And you said borrow The Fire Next Time. I know how you feel about No Name in the Street, but The Fire Next Time is interesting to me because it seems to be the book that has emerged in everyday talk and among people. If somebody picks up, I own a bookstore, and whenever people come in and say, I want one Baldwin book, they tend to want The Fire Next Time.
Yeah, Fire Next Time works like a King's I Have a Dream speech. You know what I mean? So it's that, and it leads to this gross misreading of the book and of King's speech, right? We don't really see what Baldwin is up to in that text. And it's because of how it is deployed in this moment, because there's the language of love at the end of the text, even though people don't really grapple with the way in which love is invoked in the text. I would borrow it because I really want to focus people's attention on those later works. I think, and people are going to just throw their hands up. I know Michael Thelwell disagrees with me vehemently about this. I think The Evidence of Things Not Seen is just freaking brilliant. It needs a good edit.
I was going to say, I've had this argument with people about Marvin Gaye's Here, My Dear. There are these moments where where something seems out of step and not the best one, and there will be people who see the genius in it. That's one of the claims in the barbershop that would everybody be like, oh shit, like what do you see?
Exactly right. Yeah. But you know, I think Evidence of Things Not Seen is so important, Mark, because you know he's grappling with a specific set of questions, right? What does white supremacy look like when Black folk hold the reins of power?
Right.
How are these? What does it mean? How do we wrap our minds around the fact that these babies have been murdered in Atlanta, and we run Atlanta?
Right.
And the way in which he's thinking through this, right, is just
And by the way, just to be clear, we're not talking about Atlanta right now. We're talking about the Atlanta child murders, right? So again, that it's so important to say that we're talking about 3 decades ago, not what's happening in Atlanta right now, where Black people are being killed. And so again, even the way we're talking about, it's eerie how parallel they are. I think that's what made this book so important. It's what made Baldwin so important. But your analysis as a biographer, as a literary critic, as a cultural critic, as a political analyst, all kind of come into this text in ways that are really a gift to everybody. Eddie, thank you so much for joining me today, but more importantly, thank you for writing this brilliant and wonderful book. And thank you for being the first guest on Coffee and Books.
And nobody can take that away from me.
That's right.
I was the first. Thank you so much, Mark, for just taking the time. Thank you for creating this venue, man. You know, one of the casualties of this moment is seriousness.
You ain't never lied.
And so this is just beautiful, brother. Appreciate you.
Well, best of luck to you, brother. Peace.
Thanks, man. Peace.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Coffee and Books. If you want to purchase any of the books discussed on today's episode, go to UncleBobbies.com. That's Uncle BOBBIES.com.